There is coffee. I'm just saying. That is no reflection on our next speaker. I'm just saying. It is that particular time of the day when, having enjoyed a repast, we tend to get a little addled. So, as the Horace Tracy Pitkin Professor of Historical Theology, Professor Volker Leppin's scholarship is particularly interested in medieval and Reformation studies. He argues that the Reformation should be understood as a transformation of the medieval world rather than a stark rupture. His work also focuses on the history of spirituality, mainly in mysticism. Educated at the University of Marburg, Heidelberg University, and the Theological Academic Year in Jerusalem program, Volker Leppin received a chair in church history at the University of Jena in 2000. I pronounced that right, yes. Jena. 10 years later, he moved to the University of Tübingen in southern Germany, where he held the chair in church history and directed the Institute for the Late Middle Ages and Reformation from 2010 to 2021. He is a member of the Academies of Sciences at Heidelberg, as well as the Saxonian Academy of Sciences, two distinguished scholarly societies in Germany. And we are so grateful to have you back again, as you were here 3 years ago for Colloquy, and we look forward to hearing your wisdom.
Thank you very much, Martin, for introducing me. Thank you very much for inviting me here. The third time at Luther Colloquy, and that means a lot to me. It's a great honor and a great pleasure always to be here at Gettysburg. I still remember the first time, still at that time invited by Christiana when I came here with two of my kids. That was their first encounter with the United States. And one of them, now independent of Chantal and me, came to the United States studying there. I think I owe this also to Gettysburg. They started loving the United States. And of course, whenever I come here, I bring a bit of German questions with me, even after teaching for years now at Yale and learning a lot about the American debates. There is still the German in my mind. Someone told me you can pull a German out of Germany, but not Germany out of the German. That's of course true. So my question has to do with the debates about how responsible is Martin Luther for the Peasants' War or for the slaughter the princes did against the peasants. And a part of reception history you already find out on this slide that connects smoothly with President Irwin's an introduction of this big panorama, kind of cyclorama in Bad Frankenhausen. This is a part of it. You saw this big building in Germany. It is sometimes called the Elefantenklo, the elephant's toilet, because yeah, it looks big, tall. But inside it is really, as you already heard, a marvelous painting, not only tall, but really an expression of German art in the 80s. And right in the middle, when the peasants are approaching the battlefield, you see this flag showing the German word Freiheit, freedom. That's what all was about for the peasants, and that was, of course, something that links the peasants to Martin Luther. We already heard in Vincent Evaner's talk that nevertheless there was something in Martin Luther that connected ideas of Martin Luther with the Peasants' War, and that's the line I will follow up a little bit here, looking how strong peasants could rely on Martin Luther and how far not. Luther himself, asked about that, would say, there is nothing that connects me with the peasants. He said, what they did, that means turning Christian freedom totally into flesh. So his idea is what I taught as Christian freedom is something completely spiritual. And we heard a lot about this spirituality in Martin Luther, so of course, he's right in stressing this spiritual aspect, but we also heard there is something that relates to social reality. He doesn't admit this in this sentence in the time when he saw the revolt, the upheaval coming up in Germany. He wanted to distance himself, saying, nothing about me, they are wrong, I am not. Of course, this was also a part of apologizing, self-defense against those who made him responsible for what happened. And this happened indeed on the Catholic side. Hieronymus Emser, who was one of the theologians in Leipzig, wrote about the peasants. And here in his poem, we already heard about those pamphlets with rhymes. Here in his poem, he writes, das ist das Evangelium, das ihr von Luther gelernet hon. That's the gospel you have learned from Martin Luther. And that's what he says to the peasants, your violence. That's what you learned from Martin Luther. And now Luther is, that's the lower quote, now Luther is washing his hands like Pontius Pilate did. So that's exactly reflecting on Martin Luther saying there is nothing about me and the peasants. Our concept of freedom is so different. They did everything wrong about our understanding me. He points out this was a total misunderstanding whenever they related to me. The tricky thing is Luther was not only seen as responsible for the upheaval, he was also seen as responsible for the response by the princes, the very violent response by the princes. And that came also from the Catholic side. Johannes Kochlius, also one of the most famous polemics against Martin Luther, wrote that he was the one who then called the Oberkeit, the government, against the peasants. So he was blamed for both. He was blamed for being responsible for the peasants' revolt and for the slaughter done against him. Particularly this blaming about being responsible for the princes' violence, it's something that you did not only find out on the Catholic side, but already in his time, in the words of several times mentioned this morning, Thomas Müntzer, who spoke about the spiritless, softly living flesh in Wittenberg. So the one who was not able to encourage the peasants, who did not side with their social demands, but who was the one who aligned with the princes. And this critique we would find later on in what we heard this morning in the president's speech about the frühbürgerliche Revolution, the early bourgeois revolution. This is the big illustrierte Geschichte der deutschen frühbürgerlichen Revolution, the illustrated history of this early bourgeois revolution, which was printed in 1983. For the Luther Jubilee, you could find this imprint in the GDR. This was bringing together all the research by those names mentioned. Responsible was Steinmetz, whose name you heard this morning. And there, the researchers in the GDR tried to bring together their appreciation for Thomas Müntzer and a fair understanding of Martin Luther. In the first years of GDR, Luther was just seen as the servant of the princes, the Fürstenknecht. Now, later on, a more nuanced understanding would come up in the GDR, particularly by David Steinmetz, and thinking about Martin Luther, who somehow was part in the changes of the 16th century. So this history of the frühbürgerliche Revolution summed up in these weeks, these are the weeks of the peasants' revolt, it became evident that Luther was ready to accept the existing power structure, the authority of the princes and the wealthy segments of the bourgeois allied with the territorial governors. Thus, Luther's moderate bourgeois Reformation renounced the role of remaining a unifying force for all anti-Roman and anti-feudal elements. The core of this quote is Luther was part in the early bourgeois revolution in the beginning. And someone asked this morning, what about GDR research and the understanding there was a pastor, Thomas Müller? Yeah, you're right in the middle of this room. I think you asked this question. What about the notion of a pastor in this model? The notion for Thomas Müller as well as for Martin Luther, as far as I understand, was the distinction of objective and subjective. So they said in an objective sense of history, of Marxist history, that he did the right thing, even if subjectively they still believed in religion, in what Marxist view of history would say did not play any role in the history. And so, of course, Thomas Müntzer was the praised one, but Martin Luther somehow was the approved one. He started the whole thing, and then in 1525, it turned out, it became evident, as it says here, that he was not able really to be on the side of the necessary, historically necessary revolution. We know this distinction of early Luther and late Luther. I have to confess, I know it from my own research as well. I love the early Luther much more than the older Luther, even if the older Luther has important things to say about theology. I always admit this, but this young man who wants to change everything and who struggles with his upcoming, with his own religious tradition, wants to follow a certain path, sees, I cannot follow this. That's, I find, much more exciting. And so I'm on the same line as those who make a difference between this young Luther, who, as they would say, was on the right side, and then he let the peasants down and he aligned with the princes. That's a short view on the state of the question here. The question is, how could it come that the peasants would say Luther's message of freedom instigated us, inspired us, and Luther then would say, no, you were wrong? Is it just, as Luther put it, a misunderstanding by the peasants, or maybe did the peasants understand something, maybe not correctly, but in a possible way? In theology, to take a completely other example, we have learned to think that you can understand certain texts in different traditions differently, and both ways might be legitimate. Just think about the use of the Hebrew Bible in Jewish religion and in Christian religion. We have two paths following the Old Testament with different understanding, and to a certain degree, I would argue the peasants had a certain understanding of Luther's writings, even if the author himself later on would say, this is wrong. Maybe they were not totally wrong, but followed a possible way. To understand this, in a first chapter, I try to evolve what peasants understood when they used the term of Freiheit, of freedom. And of course, the text to look at are the 12 articles mentioned this morning, which were brought together, presumably by Sebastian Lotzer, in the first half of 1525. 12 articles in which you see at least one very clear consequence of the Reformation. At the margins, you always see those biblical quotes. Everything is full of those biblical quotes. They relied on the scripture and the scripture alone. That was their argument. And they started with some very much Reformation-like sounding claims, particularly demanding that every congregation should have their own pastor and should be able to vote who this should be. And then in the third article, they come to what we can see as the key demand of these 12 articles. This is the demand of being freed from serfdom, being gaining liberty from their time-tested or long-time hold serfdom in the society. They argued for this in a very cautious way. When they brought this together, they wanted to make very much clear that they didn't want to rebel against the government. You see right on the top or on the right side what they quote, Romans 13. I think I don't have to make many words about what this means. Everyone has to obey their government. That's what they approve. Yes, we follow this line. Well, if you then look a bit down, you will find Acts 5, which sounds a little bit different to this. This is, of course, Acts 5:29. We must obey God rather than any human authority. Throughout my studies and my research, I was always glad that we not only have Romans 13, but also Acts 5:29 that says a lot about the limitations of the government. And we have to add, Luther would agree. Of course, there are those limitations. The Peasants would highlight this very much. So their understanding of how to obey the government and how far to obey the government, that is very clearly based in these two biblical quotes. A bit more difficult it is to understand how they come biblically to the understanding that salvation does not only make our soul free, but also our bodies. That salvation by Jesus Christ brings social freedom with it. If you look at the biblical quotes, they bring for it the most famous Isaiah 53, which of course with the servant of God is a very important passage about salvation. Actually, it doesn't say a lot about social freedom. And so it is the case with the other quotes mentioned here. The closest to their demand comes 1 Corinthians 7:23, which is highlighted here as well. You were bought with a price. Do not become slaves of humans. So that's an idea, even if every one of you knows that Paul was not a hero of anti-slavery movement. He was more calling to stay in your state. At least the wording of this line says something that the Peasants could use in the sense of salvation makes us free, not only regarding our soul, but our body as well. That's the theological argument, which again follows the Reformation by this exclusive use of the Bible, but does not follow exactly an argument by Martin Luther when arguing for bodily freedom. To understand what resonates in them, we have to broaden the perspective over only Martin Luther and the Peasants. There was a broad discourse in this time about freedom. And whenever someone called for freedom, they had to have in mind that the call for freedom at first was a political one and was present in political discourse, in public discourse, as a political claim, particularly among those who brought together religion and nation, as Martin Luther sometimes did. And Martin Luther followed here or aligned with Ulrich von Hutten, a knight in southern Germany, quite a dubious figure. That's because usually Luther research doesn't like to link Martin Luther to Ulrich von Hutten. He was what we call a Hasardeur in German, someone who made some brave enterprises, to some bold enterprises in military terms, but he framed the discourse about freedom in the years of 1519, 1520, including his writing Klag in Vermahnung, so grievance against those oppressing us. Obviously, this followed the line of the late medieval Gravamina, the claims of the Germans as being oppressed. And here in this writing, again, one of those rhymed pamphlets, we see him fighting against des Papsts vermeinte Freiheit, so the Pope's alleged freedom and the infidelity of the Pope. On the left side and on the right side, highlighted, you see, Bitt Gott Freiheit deutscher Nation. Ask God, pray to God for the freedom of the German nation. That's how this term was framed by Ulrich von Nohutten. Freedom was something particularly lacking in the German nation and particularly demanded for by the German nation. It went on like this in his writing when he wrote, Wohlauf, lieben frommen Deutschen, es ist Zeit, dass wir unsere jetzt so lang herverlorene Freiheit wiederum zu erlangen untersuchen. So, come on, Germans, take your freedom which we have lost back. And you hear in this sound that has a kind of military sound, particularly when written by a knight in this time, particularly when it ends up with this line, trotz Romanist, which you can translate in defiance of the Romans, which also alludes to what in German is known as a Trutzburg, so a castle against someone, a castle in defiance. This is kind of violent speech, or at least speech playing with violence, attached to what Ulrich von Nohutten claims to be a speech for freedom. And he was not the only one who had this political understanding of freedom in those years between 1520 and 1525. In 1523 was a treatise published which was basically the most influential for the peasants, Deutscher Nation Notdurft, so what is necessary for the German nation. The author, the alleged author, was Emperor Frederick III, who reigned in the middle of the 15th century. Of course, that is just a fake to make him the author of this. This was a product of the time of 1523. And there, with the term freedom, a political program was depicted throughout this pamphlet that said the German nation has to free itself from particularly Roman suppression. Not only religiously, also culturally. In the German culture, there was a deep conflict or a deep rebuke against anything that was Romanesque, against the French, against the Romans. And this part, this treatise played part in this. It was polemical against anything that was Roman, particularly against the Pope, and it claimed that the Pope took freedom from the Germans, and the Germans have to take freedom back to restore human freedom in Christian order. Human freedom in Christian order, which the true and veracious Antichrist has hidden and suppressed for us poor Christians, together with the gospel and other words. Of course, the Antichrist, calling the papacy Antichrist, that's what Luther did since around 1519, 1520. It came from Martin Luther. And we see this political understanding of human freedom in Christian order. That's an understanding of freedom that is not only spiritual, that is very, very much societal, very, very much political. And this writing, even if allegedly written by Frederick III in the 15th century referred to the Reformation. That's easygoing because it was a prophecy, so Frederick III, of course, could know everything about Reformation. Poor historians say maybe it is more likely that the author knew about the Reformation in the aftermath. So that's one of the arguments why we would say this was written after Luther had published his 95 Theses and has published his treatises. This Reformation now was interpreted in this text as fulfilling of Isaiah 35. So the blind would see, the dumb would hear. We are in a messianic time. And this messianic time brings human freedom to all humans, including those who were the most suppressed, meaning including the peasants. This time of the Messiah also would bring what then is called the common good. You heard this morning that Peter Blickler rightly has said the revolution of 1525 was the revolution of the common man. That refers to what humanists would argue to be the goal for society, the common good. This writing says the Messiah brings it, and the Messiah is the one who brings this common good in terms of freedom. This understanding of Reformation as an eschatological time, of course, resonates totally with what Martin Luther would say, interpreting his own time and his own person. You saw those images from the Wartburg this morning where he wrote his postil. And this room on the Wartburg, or the entire Wartburg, was something he called his Patmos. So he was sitting there like the visionary John was sitting on his Patmos, invoking the end of the days. That resonates in this writing, maybe in a more chiastic way than Martin Luther himself would interpret his role. So this comes closer to Thomas Müntzer, who also followed a chiastic idea. But this apocalyptic idea, we are in the last days, that is shared by many people on the Reformation side. And this is one of the moments to mention how much we as Reformation scholars owe to Heiko Obermann, who has shown how much the thinking of Martin Luther was embedded into apocalyptic thinking. It was broadly shared in Reformation, and to a certain degree also this political program was shared. When in 1523, this author, who then was so influential to the peasants, wrote about this human freedom and wrote against the suppression by the Pope, he had in his ear still what Martin Luther had said on the Diet of Worms in 1521, when Luther said, "For this can no one deny or conceal, since the experience of all and every one witness that through the laws of the Pope and human doctrines, the consciences of the faithful have been most miserably ensnared, tormented, and flayed, and that the goods and chattels foremost in this renowned nation of Germany have been devoured and are still being devoured by incredible tyranny without end and in indecent ways." We already heard how much Martin Luther understood papacy as a tyranny. That's what he then did here in Worms, and he evoked what Ulrich von Hutten had brought into debate. He evoked the freedom of the German nation. We poor Germans, we are so suppressed compared to others. That was not totally wrong because, because France was in a better situation. They had made some treatises in the 15th century between the French king and the Pope, particularly the pragmatic de Bourges, I'm just missing one word. So there was this edict by the French king in Bourges in the middle of the 15th century, where he claimed freedom of the French church, pragmatic Sanson, de Bourges, where he claimed freedom of the French church against the Pope. So the French church was in a much better state of independence of the Pope. So the Germans, since the middle of the 15th century, would grieve about this in the already mentioned gravamina, which were issued on every diet, telling how bad the state is in Germany. Looking from the outside, one could also say the French were just smarter than the Germans. They did it, they got independence, and the Germans did not. However, the outcome was like Luther describes it, and the debate was the one framed by Ulrich von Hutten, a debate about German freedom. And now in this context, between 1520, 1523 and 1525, I want to highlight what Luther's freedom actually looked like. Of course, there was this understanding of very spiritual freedom in his treatise on the freedom of a Christian, where he said, thirdly, let us consider the inner spiritual person to see what it means for him to be and to be called a devout, free Christian person. It is clear that no external thing can make him free or righteous, no matter what it may be called, because his righteousness and freedom, as well as his sinfulness and bondage, are not bodily or external. What benefit is it to the soul if the body is unfettered, strong, and healthy, eats, drinks, and lives as it pleases? Conversely, what harm does it do the soul if the body is imprisoned? What harm does it do the soul if the body is imprisoned? I don't know if anyone of you is a chaplain in a prison, and you might think this is, as Vince Evans said, this is kind of detached from external understanding. So what harm does it do the soul if the body is imprisoned, sick and weak, hungry, thirsty, and suffering against its will? None of these things reach the soul to either free or imprison it, to make it righteous or sinful. That's what he says in his treatise on freedom. And based on this, we can say, however we argue about this, it sounds, as I highlighted, to some degree a bit cynical, but given this, we can say Luther was right in 1525 to say they turned something spiritual into something fleshly. If we only had this, he were right. We have some other words about freedom in 1520. The treatise on the freedom of a Christian was not the only treatise issued in 1520. There was also the treatise to the nobility an den christlichen Adel deutscher Nation, German nation, deutscher Nation, about improvement of the Christian estate. And there was, to take this first, De Captivitate Babylonica, about the captivity, the Babylonian captivity of the church. Of course, when you write about captivity, you write about freedom. Of course, that is pretty much clear. And there already on the captivity, you can see how the program of freedom against captivity turns into a, at least, church political program. Theologically, this treatise is only about the sacraments. Of course, Luther reduces the range of 7 sacraments to 2 or 3 sacraments, debating a little bit about penance, but highlighting there are baptism and the Eucharist as sacraments. So that's very doctrinal and theological, but at least at latest when it comes to the sacrament of ordination, that touches the whole canonical law in the Middle Ages, and that has a lot of impact in social terms. And that is even more the case, of course, in his treatise to the nobility, which in its title does not talk about freedom, of course, but you only have to open it on the first pages of this treatise, and you will see how freedom plays into the picture. He starts with blaming the Roman Church of protecting themselves against any kind of attack, critique, debate by building 3 walls around them. We want to attack the first wall first. It has been devised that the Pope, bishops, priests, and monks are called the spiritual estate, while princes, lords, craftsmen, and farmers are called the temporal estate. So the first wall is the distinction of lay people and ordained people. The second wall is even weaker and more disgraceful. They alone want to be masters of Scripture, even though they have learned nothing in it their whole life. They arrogantly claim sole authority, juggle before us with shameless words. The Pope cannot err in matters of faith, whether he's wicked or pious. Set aside all those polemics. Set aside that there was no doctrine of infallibility of the Pope in this time. The argument is that the Church claims for itself that a decisive decision about how Scripture has to be read is only made by the Church, at least by councils, we should add. The third wall falls of itself when the first two fall, for if the Pope acts against Scripture, we are obliged to stand by Scripture, to rebuke him and to constrain him. They also have no foundation in Scripture that it belongs to the Pope alone to call or confirm a council. So the third wall would be the Pope alone has the right to call a council. Three walls, and throughout his writing, Luther attacks these walls and then depicts a program of reform of the Church, and I have to add, of the German Church. So, throughout the writing, he says how the German Church should be independent of the Pope. However, what I want to highlight here is, if you talk about walls which you attack, that's again something which I would call speech of violence. Just think about what images you have in mind when people attack walls. This is an illustration of that time. You also can think biblically about the walls of a famous city of Jericho, of course. And even if the Israelites only had some music instruments to tear them down, and bringing down walls is a violent act, and attacking them is a violent act. So this Martin Luther of 1520, at least in his wording, plays with violence, and he connects this with freedom. Throughout this writing to the nobility, he speaks of the spirit of freedom, den Geist der Freiheit, about people being bold and free, mutig und frei, that they should urge someone. So you see a kind of somehow militaristic speech connected to this freedom speech, bringing both together the treatise on the captivity and the treatise to the nobility. We have a program that shows that Luther claims that there is a certain kind of freedom that now lacks, particularly in the German nation, and that has to be restored. If I read this as someone who feels suppressed, of course I would say, yes, that's what I need now in my social situation. And that's what this author of 1523 did. That's what the Peasants did. They understood this as encouraging them to fight against those who took their freedom. And they could even refer to certain lines in Martin Luther's writing to the nobility when he writes, I only wish to have instigated thoughts in those who are able and inclined to help the German nation become Christian and free once more after the wretched, heathenish and unchristian rule of the Pope. So to help the German nation become free, how would you help the German nation to become free? Of course, if we would meet Luther on the street in Wittenberg, asking him, how do you do this? He would answer, by the word alone. But his word was powerful, and people could understand his word in another way than he maybe meant it when he spoke about our freedom, unsere Freiheit. And he does so in the context of the German nation. So unsere Freiheit, our freedom, is not the Christian freedom here. That's the German freedom he's talking about. This is a kind of blurry speech we find in Martin Luther, as we find in many cases. So if you only, I'm well known for writing quite a lot, so I know Sometimes it happens that in one book you write something that is not fully consistent with the other book. Unfortunately, sometimes reviewers notice this, and then you think, shame on me. But however, Martin Luther was writing much more than I do. And Martin Luther was writing under pressure. He was not sitting at his desk, calmly writing. He was urgently writing. He wrote these treatises in a few weeks. So no worry about this, that they are not consistent in themselves. I would not blame him for this. But making this in the aftermath, when this revolt happened, like being something unison, without those distinctions in itself, that's not a way to deal with this. What at least we now as researchers have to admit is this language of Martin Luther was so multifold that, again, the peasants could feel encouraged to take what they had as weapons at hand. Taking another quote from this treatise that might be even clearer, it is also too much that in canon law such high value is placed on the spiritual freedom, body and possessions of the clergy, as if the laity were not also equally good Christian people as they are, or as if they did not belong to the church. Why is your body, life, property and honor so free and not mine, since we are equally Christians of the same baptism, faith, spirit and everything else? That directly addresses the distinction of lay people and clergy in the canon law, a very strong theological argument, and it directly addresses the social inequality between clergy and lay people. And that's where the peasants started their revolt against the clergy. We have this list this morning of all those castles on the one hand, but monasteries on the other hand, which were taken over by the peasants, and where the peasants had their revolt against, because those monasteries were so rich and luxurious that they said that is not according to God's rule, and they could say Luther had it. Luther had exactly this, and that was not only a remark at the side. It is based in one of the most important convictions in Luther's theology. If you look at the end, we have the same baptism. That is referring to what empowers the lay people. In the same treatise, in De Captivitate Babylonica, on the captivities, he says that this glory of our freedom and the knowledge of baptism are today taken captive. Freedom. Whom can we hold responsible for this, if not solely the tyranny of the Bishop of Rome? So the freedom of the baptism, which makes lay people priests. For whoever has crawled out of baptism may boast that he is already, and we have to add, of course, he, she, they, is already consecrated as priest, bishop, and pope, even though it is not fitting for everyone to exercise such office. To be clear about this, that was not an attack against their ordination in general, but it made clear by baptism there's no distinction within Christianity. And this baptism makes us the same as the clergy, and this should have some consequences in terms of being rich or poor, because the traditional difference between clergy and lay people regarding poverty or richness is not rooted in any Christian rule, and this Christian rule of baptism is against it. Again, reading this as a peasant in this time, that would very much encourage me to fight against the clergy. And that's what a major part of this revolt of the common man was about. All right, so this was the historical argument about that Martin Luther was somehow responsible for what happened in 1525. He just tried to withdraw himself from this. Now, of course, why did he do so? What was the reasonable against this? There was a clear, reasonable, rational in his teaching on the two kingdoms, and we even can admit that was evolved later than those writings in 1520. It is his writing about temporal authority of 1523, in which he developed his idea of the two kingdoms. And very often in research about Luther and the Peasants, you will find, yeah, all right, of course, he argued aligning himself with his doctrine of the two kingdoms, or two governments, as I usually prefer to say. In terms of how researchers come to their convictions, I just want to remind that the strongest voice to argue this was about the teaching of two kingdoms was Paul Althaus, who used the doctrine of the two kingdoms to calm protests down in the Third Reich. Just to make clear, there was a context, a very strong biographical context in Paul Althaus to use this argument. Luther just thought in line with the doctrine of two kingdoms when he rebuked the peasants. That doesn't make this argument wrong. I think there is something in this argument to say that Martin Luther followed his doctrine of two kingdoms, which basically says that God has given two governments into this world. The one government represented by temporal authorities, which enforces the law of God in its political sense to fight against the sin. So if the law of God says, you shall not kill, then the authority, the temporal authority, would enforce this law by means of imprisoning people, of beheading people, and so on, to make God's law present and respected in this world by means of the law. While on the other hand, the spiritual government, as represented by the preachers, would preach the gospel and the law in theological sense, which in theological use, which means that gives us to think about our own sins. And now there we are. We see that Martin Luther very much highlighted the fourth commandment within his teaching on the two kingdoms. So you have to obey your father and mother, and then his interpretation of the fourth commandment says mother and father are also represented in temporal authorities, so we have to follow them, and that's political use. If you now look at those commandments in a broader sense of theological use makes us understand our sin and also enables us to change our soul, even if we will remain sinners throughout our life. We can always work on ourselves to change our mind. And now taking the fifth commandment again, thou shalt not kill, and looking at what Martin Luther says in his catechisms about this commandment, then this does mean not only you should not kill someone directly. For most of us, it might be easy in this room to say, so far as I remember, I never did this. But then Martin Luther says, it is also about you should not harm anyone. You should not think anything evil about someone. And when it comes so far, I definitely know at least one person in this room has not followed this rule. There were moments in my life when I thought evil about someone. There were moments when I harmed someone. And taking this commandment in theological sense to think about ourselves and then to draw conclusions, then I would have wished that Martin Luther, when he wrote his violent writings against the peasants in 1525, calling the authorities against the peasants, would have thought a bit more about the theological use of this commandment and about this commandment telling us you should not harm anyone, you should not wish anyone any evil. He did not so. if we do so, I think we could found our ethics still respecting the doctrine of the two kingdoms in a certain sense, but we could ground this in a kind of Lutheran ethics of solidarity with those who are suppressed, and so we might overcome what is embarrassing and shaming in Martin Luther's writings when he wrote violently against the peasants. We could more follow his call to freedom with political impact that he evolved in the early years of 1520. Thank you very much for listening. Yeah, of course.
All right. I can't look at this and not think about Hieronymus Bosch for some reason.
Yeah.
But
he is using Hieronymus Bosch a lot in his writing.
All right. So I'm not off the mark there. That's good. Questions for Dr. Leppin? He's given us a lot to think about.
Thank you so much for your talk. It's wonderful. Just on your last point there, I know it's 4 years later, but in 1529, Small Catechism, when there's a vision to, there's the negative side of the commandments, but then there's the vision, you should also do good, you should build up. Would you care to comment on that? And is that like a late-breaking part for Luther, or he just couldn't have any positive vision about revolution at all?
I think even in the 30s, he was very much inclined to say you never should use violence against those whom God has brought into power. And to take him out of blaming him too much, one has to say, even when it was about himself, he said, I don't want any protection by violence against the authorities. When after 1530, then after the Augsburg Diet, the Protestants started building their small-called alliance, he said, no, we shall not resist the authorities. And they were the Wittenberg lawyers who convinced him, well, your prince in Saxony is kind of political authority. He can fight against the emperor as a higher authority. And then he said, oh, all right, we can do this. But his first approach was to say, no, don't protect Reformation by violence. Don't protect me by violence. God will do everything. So at least at this point, we have to say he was consistent with himself that he never would argue for revolt.
Thank you so much for your talk today. What I've been thinking about since Dr. Avner spoke and hearing you speak is, it sounds to me like you might suggest that Luther is an innovative interpreter of Scripture and writes in many places, especially in 1520, about this gospel of liberation or freedom, but he's not fully aware of this kind of law of unintended consequences that I think as preachers, any preachers in the room here might understand. You might preach something and something comes out of it that you did not expect from your people who are listening. Maybe that they're actually listening at all, and say so afterward. So I'm wondering what you might say about, because after 1522, when he returns to Wittenberg from the Wartburg, he goes and has to address the unintended consequences of his innovations, i.e. in dispute with Karlstadt and other, reform-minded leaders who have been implementing reforms, that he says, oh, no, that we've gone too far. We have to slow down. I'm wondering if you might say something about this, and if this is something that you consider, you think about when you think about Luther in this time frame as someone who is an innovative interpreter and yet also at the same time is a kind of realist who sees the political and social reality in a particular way as a late medieval scholar who needs the princes to, in some way, continue to protect him so he can continue to do this work more slowly over time. I'm wondering about that because, as I think sometimes the gospel moves faster than we do as a church. And sometimes we can get in the way of the gospel, but also the gospel in its purity is a challenge to all of us. And maybe was a challenge to Luther himself. And he wrote things that maybe were difficult for him to even imagine or perceive ought to be lived out in real life.
There's this famous book by Brett Gregory, The Unintended Reformation, that even brings this into a broader picture, very critical about Reformation. Brett Gregory is a nice guy, but he doesn't love Reformation. So he says, unintendedly, unwittingly, Martin Luther is responsible for everything what secularization brought to us. I think that's exaggerating the point you rightly made. So I would agree that Martin Luther, of course, in the beginning, just wanted to bring people to be more pious. So when he wrote to his confessor Staupitz in March 1518, he said, I didn't want to write anything else than John Tauler, of whom you heard this morning, and the Theologia Deutsch had written. So he said, that's everything I wanted, which means interiorizing the piety, this spiritual reform we heard about this morning, nothing more. And then he ran into political conflicts. He among his gifts was not to bring differences together. So he made very clear, if you follow this line, then there is a problem in the spirituality of indulgences. And still at this moment, he was not aware of the fact that abandoning indulgences would affect the whole financial system of the church. He would only later learn about how this Peter's indulgence would play into the economical system of his time. Still, he was a spiritual author. And then, step by step, mostly instigated by his adversaries, he would broaden his program. And so this, what I showed here, is also part of this, bringing something into the public without understanding what would come out. And you are so right, thinking about sermons, thinking about whatever you publish, you never know how people would receive this. And what I'm relying on in terms of theory of research, that's the theory of reception, or the aesthetics of reception, a theory that says that nothing what you write has only one sense, but everything you write are beyond mathematics. So everything you write is somehow ambiguous. And that's what happens here. It is ambiguous, and the peasants took some part of this ambiguity, and he decided to close this ambiguity by his later definition.
Just to follow up, don't you suppose, though, that he would have been aware that there would have been some sort of eisegetical partaking of his writings in such a way that it could have resulted in this? Could he have not foreseen this somehow, or?
He's when you look at him, how he speaks about claritas scripturae, we would even say he is a kind of naive in terms of the unique understanding of certain words. if you think that the year of 1529 was mentioned, if you think of this year, he just shows the words of institution to Zwingli in Marburg, hoc est corpus meum, and he thinks everything is done there.
Yeah.
And Zwingli says, no, we still have to debate this. So Luther had a very simplistic hermeneutics in this sense, not in other sense, not to now I'm afraid to be understood in the wrong way. So he had a very nuanced hermeneutics with the biblical texts, with the promé and everything like that, but his understanding words are clear, and everyone who is open-minded and not driven by the devil will understand it correctly.
Well, that narrows it down somewhat.
Yes.
One question I have about Luther's, and thank you very much for this Freiheit approach to thinking about the power of baptism, and I think the Babylonian captivity of the church. This is written after he's been excommunicated. So what you have there is he's no longer recognized as a clerical authority in the world that he has lived in all this time. So I'm not trying to think back with what we know about Luther as being leading a church. I'm thinking back to his solitary experience of being ripped of his office.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking about that, and then so wouldn't the people around him see him then maybe as a figure more approachable because he's been lowered in his status, even though he's inspiring spiritually, but externally he's been demoted.
Yeah. So formally he wasn't yet excommunicated. That would happen in January 1521, but of course the process was underway, and the bull that would threaten him with excommunication was issued in June of 1520. So that's just the historical mind in me that says formally it is a bit different, but that doesn't affect your argument anyway, because I would totally agree. His kind of authority changed, and he now looked for other ways of authority, and we can see this since the accusation was brought to Rome, which happened already in December 1517. What did he start to read? Of course, he read the canon law. And in the canon law, he found, and he quotes this expressly, he found Augustine's quote that the only writings that would bind me are the biblical writings. And there he refers to all time, so he has to shift his authority, as you said, which was authority by consecration, to the authority by the Bible. And that, I think your question makes something clear about this, why he trusted so much in the clarity of the scripture, because that was now his ground to argue against the papacy. And then at this comes a kind of prophetic self-understanding. What I meant with this being on the Patmos and being the fighter against the Antichrist, he was the one who revealed that papacy is the Antichrist. So he felt he had a kind of role in the eschatological events of his days.
Well, thank you so much for your lecture. While you were talking, I was sort of, and I love the fact that you ended with the note of ambiguity, because I have parishioners who have insisted on their Second Amendment right to have guns in their houses, and their houses are full of guns. But when I pressed them, they were very afraid that a progressive government would oppress them and they would have to take arms against the government. Now, with a different, and you don't need to respond, you can be safe in your response. Now with a different government in power, right, they are much more concerned about protecting the government in power, right, than and against, progressives who might resist, right, then you get the point, right? I'm wondering if Luther's social location changed in 1525, in that he was drawing more legitimacy from the prince than than he was from the people whom he was defending early on, in the young Luther whom we all love.
So what we can see is indeed that what we heard about his marginalized situation is true for the early 20s. So if we make the line from your question, saying he was then marginalized, and so he had to look for another kind of authority. And then indeed in 1525, his marginalization ended because the prince, the elector Frederick the Wise, died in May 1525, who always had protected him, but not openly. And John the Steadfast would take over, and John the Steadfast would steadfastly support Martin Luther, and so give him a new social position, and that indeed made him very strong against the peasants, and that brought him in the future days to rebuke other marginalized groups. We can even see that his tone about heretics would change. In the early 20s, he would say, yeah, we should be kind to heretics. And then when it comes to Anabaptists, they are clear heretics, and he would not appreciate them, to say the least. And also the tone against the Jews changed. In the early 20s, he was on the same plate with them. Both sides felt suppressed by the papacy, and so he aligned with them to a certain degree, not theologically, but social, in the society, and legally in his famous treatise about Jesus as a born Jew. And then already in the late 20s, it starts that he is more and more writing against the Jews, and we all know how it ended up in the 40s.
Thank you again, Doctor, and let's share some appreciation. We'll have a 10-minute break and reconvene with our panel. All right, friends, the hour is upon us, and we have the Reverend Dr. Nelson Rivera, who teaches courses in theology and ethics here at ULS. He's previously taught at Moravian University and Theological Seminary, the Lutheran Theological Seminary at Philadelphia, and as a visiting professor at the Evangelical Seminary of Puerto Rico. His published work covers topics in Lutheran theology, theologies of liberation, Latinx ministry and spirituality, and on the application of evolutionary epistemology in theology and the sciences. Dr. Rivera has served as a translator, editor, and theological consultant for worship and church resources. An ordained minister of the ELCA, he served congregations in his native Puerto Rico and the Philadelphia area. Dr. Rivera has served extensively in programs and committees across the academy and the church, including the Faith and Leadership Academy, the ELCA Theological Roundtable, Moravian University's Tenure, Promotion, and Review Committee, that must have been fun, and most recently as member of the 13th round of the Lutheran Catholic Dialogue in the USA. For years now, he's been a mentor and advisor to PhD students through the Hispanic Theological Initiative Network. So let's welcome him to our space here.
Thank you.
And he's going to give kind of a talk, a summation perhaps, and then we'll let our panelists deconstruct that, and then we'll enter into the fray with all of you. So, blessings.
Thank you, Martin. You're very kind with the words that you use. Actually, I wrote it, now I remember. Okay. Okay, thank you. Good afternoon. I was given a specific task. First, I've been given 20 minutes. You blame President Irwin for that. to speak, to address some of the possible questions that this topic brings to mind, especially in today's context. In my case, it has been suggested that I can speak from a Latin American, Caribbean perspective, especially from the view of a theology of liberation. Now, given the constraints of time, I will be very specific about what I chose to talk or address. The title that I have given is Reform, Liberation, or Revolt? A question, right? And then the panelists will have a chance either to respond to what I said, I am hoping not, or they will have the chance with an additional Q&A with you all. Does it sound like a deal? Okay. I have some remarks. In recent decades in Latin America, in the context of a theology of liberation, over 1,000 priests, religious sisters, and lay leaders have been killed by oppressive forces, especially by authoritarian and military regimes. In addition, populations of indigenous, peasant, and poor communities have been decimated. In the context of war, other conflicts, and more. Death threats and violence have been systematically used to quiet all their voices. Inevitably, debates around the need to reform or to revolt have emerged from time to this very day. Given our focus on the German peasants' revolt, I have been asked to share a few words on the conversation among Latin American theologians on the options and proper response to situations of deep poverty, violence, and the brutal repression of myriad communities carried out by governments. Due to time's constraints, I can only focus on a couple of examples from pastors and theologians of the church in such dire circumstances, among them prophetic voices, committed revolutionaries, and martyrs for the cause of the poor and the oppressed. First, Camilo Torres. Camilo was a Colombian priest, the product of a well-to-do family with social and ecclesial connection, someone really well educated in Latin America and in Europe. You may know that Camilo was killed in 1966 after joining a revolutionary group in the mountains of his native country, Colombia. Before joining the fight for political freedom, Camilo tried to work for changes in society in various ways through active political and engagement and civil engagement participation. Camilo Torres was a preacher, an academic, professor of sociology, community organizer, and a journalist. In all those fronts, Camilo advocated for the poor and marginal. He supported workers' rights and student movements. After years of active participation in popular movements, in popular initiative, Camilo concluded that political and economic reforms were of little benefit for the majority of the population. The actual beneficiaries of government programs of reforms were the elite of the major political parties, as well as some church hierarchies. Eventually, he saw that the only option left was to combat the institutionalized violence of the system through the counter-violence of popular movements. Moreover, he saw that as a Christian imperative. In Camilo's own words, and I quote, this is from one of his essays. I believe that the revolutionary struggle is a Christian struggle and a priestly one. Indeed, in the present specific conditions of Colombia, participation in that struggle is the only way men can show love for their neighbors as they should. I am giving up one of the privileges I hold most dear, the celebration of the church's ritual, in order to create conditions which will give to that ritual a more authentic meaning. If I make this sacrifice, I do so in the belief that my commitment to my fellow countrymen oblige me to it. The ultimate criterion on human decisions is love, supernatural love. I am prepared to run all the risk that love may ask of me. The controversy about whether Camilo carried a weapon or not has been divisive and inconclusive, despite what the critics have argued. Regardless, one of the biographers wrote about one reliable testimony, and he writes, and I quote, that Camilo Torres is reported to have taken 3 possessions with him when he left to join the guerrillas: a small pocket Bible, a black pullover sweater of which he was especially fond, and his smoking pipe. About the smoking pipe, it is said that he commented to one of his colleagues in the fighting that there was no time to use it, unfortunately. The fighting demanded the whole time. 4 months after an interview where he reiterated his commitment to the poor and his love for his people and his commitment to the fighting, just 4 months later, he was dead. To be clear, most liberation theologians have not advocated violence in casting down the mighty from their seats, though many were willing to consider it as a legitimate option. In this, those pastors and theologians in the Latin American context, in this, they were hardly more radical than Pope Paul VI, who, in his 1967 encyclical, Populorum Progressio, wrote that, and I quote, revolutionary uprising might be justified where there is manifest long-standing tyranny which would do great damage to fundamental personal rights and dangerous harm to the common good of the country. Now, the Pope also makes clear that he's on the side of reform rather than revolt, but leave a bit of a door open. Many felt that the prevailing Latin American situation met the standard set by Pope Paul VI. Next one, Ignacio Ellacuría. Ignacio was one of the Jesuits assassinated in 1989. There were 6 of them, plus the maid and her daughter. 8 people assassinated in the rooms that were annexed to the University of Central America, the Jesuit headquarters at the time. Ignacio is considered to have been one of the most brilliant minds of his time, philosophically, theologically, and politically speaking. Sadly, most of his writings are not translated from the Spanish. Most of his production is not. Ignacio was concerned with the life of the many poor and the challenge of institutionalized violence, not just in El Salvador, but across Latin America. For him, the Latin American situation, especially in El Salvador, was a matter of life and death. By the way, Ignacio was exiled twice back to Spain, his country of origin, only to make his way back eventually into El Salvador. For Ignacio, dangerous times of human crisis that produce deep conflicts, divisions, and unrest in society require more than a purely political or military solution. Moreover, any theoretical analysis of conflict needs to lead to practical solutions for all. The principles that we apply to such challenging, dire circumstances, whatever their precedents, those commitments that drive people's actions are still principles, and therefore subject to historical context, according to Ejacuría. Only principles that allow a confrontation with the reality of what is, the reality of facts, are worthy of consideration. But all principles, according to Ignacio, would be, no matter how beautiful they are, limited in what they can do for us. In my view, one of Ignacio's main contributions was to connect the crucifixion of Jesus to the suffering of contemporary people, whom he called, and he wrote a long essay about it, the crucified people of God. Or the crucified peoples of Latin America, his context. His theology calls for an active struggle to remove those people, the crucified ones, down from their crosses by addressing the structures that cause their suffering. Moreover, he wanted us to see how their crucifixion needs to compel us to look critically to our own privileged circumstances and not to shield us from looking at ourselves critically, meaning the extent of our own participation. The imperative to bring the crucified ones down from the crosses argues for the appropriateness of the language of revolution and not merely reform. That's an actual quote from Ignacio's writings. Again, the imperative to bring the crucified ones down from their crosses argues for the appropriateness of the language of revolution and not merely reform. He actually wrote a book, a little book about a theology of revolution. He wasn't alone. Also, Joseph Coblan, who was from Belgium but made his house in Latin America for more than 50 years, also wrote a theology of revolution, but in multiple layers of meaning. Revolution. However, Ignatius's focus on following Oscar Romero pointed Ignacio on a different path than that of Camilo Torres. And he knew both, especially Romero, very well. Again, Ignacio's focus on following Oscar Romero pointed him on a different path from that of Camilo. And remember, Ignacio survived Romero for 9 years. Romero was assassinated in 1980, Ignacio in 1989. Ejacuría's theology is not a theoretical exercise, but an actual praxis, meaning a philosophy grounded in the material reality of human suffering and the need to change circumstances. He believed that the truth of the Christian faith must be verified historically through these active engagement in society. As a Christian theologian, he understood that so much death cannot become another concept, artifact, or book reference, but must lead to a resurrection and new life to a people, especially to a crucified people. Tragically, the structure of what exists, as he would say, is hard, but reconstruction is even harder to do. Therefore, violence must stop on all sides. But it doesn't happen that easily. Nevertheless, popular revolutionary fronts with a tendency towards militarized solutions happen when political solutions have all failed. That no political solutions exist become then the conviction, at least of a few, probably of the many. According to his colleague and friend John Sobrino, and I quote from Sobrino, Ejacuría would not absolutely exclude the possibility of legitimate violence, but would say that from a Christian point of view, that of the following of the historical Jesus, Christians should not make use of violence. Just to be clear, right? Ignacio believed that military solutions alone would not work. But he wouldn't completely discard their use in some specific circumstances. Even when one, because as he said, even when one side in the armed struggle might win decisively, whatever the side, the roots and causes of the conflict will remain. So, say, total military victory by one side will not really change the roots of the cause, of the situation, of the causes. Conclusion. What matters is to point, and this is something that both Ejacuría and Sobrino and others have insisted on it. I have written so much, especially Sobrino, a whole book about it. What matters is to point to compassion. The one that can lead people to a commitment that cares and defends the least among us and even risk life for others. In reality, martyrdom has been the predominant outcome for hundreds of Latin American pastors, theologians, and lay leaders alike. That has been, I would say, the overwhelming experience, martyrdom. Countless victims without a known name, but who have been named now, meaning as suffering servants, innocent victims, martyrs, the crucified people of God, as Ejacuría named them. They are the saints before any personal or moral judgment, more deserving of that acknowledgement than the usual elitist recipients of that honor. Thank you for your patience. Now, breathe in. Yeah, no, I don't.
Can you hear me? Is this on? Good, thank you. When I suggested, Dr. Rivera, that you lead us in this panel, I was not trying to restrict the amount of time you'd have for this, but simply to relieve you of the burden of having to create an entire presentation out of nothing 2 weeks in advance. So, but let me say that one of the reasons I'm especially grateful to my colleague for being willing to give us this introduction is the degree to which I have in recent years, and especially in this reiteration of study of the Peasants' War, have been just shocked and horrified by the relative callousness of the way in which people dealt with each other in the 16th century. It's a different world, one we can't imagine being in, and we shouldn't try to create something that we can't. But still, that a teacher and preacher like Luther, who had such deep and compassionate understanding of the way the gospel had been shackled by the church, and was so ardently desiring to open the gospel to the world in ways that he, I think, must have hoped would be transformative, even if he had no idea of the ultimate power of what he was doing. How somebody with that depth of spiritual sensitivity could have been so blind to the physical and material realities around him in a world in which, compared to us, everyone was poor and without all the benefits we have. And the distance between the poorest and the richest was far smaller than it is today. And yet, it just seems to me in this entire discourse around the Peasants' War, there's very little understanding is shown by the participants about the real situation of other people. And that just, the absence of that is shocking to me, that there is no pastoral tone. It's about the rightness of rebellion or the fact that one is led by the devil into some kind of disobedience. Because it's really couched as being about obedience and disobedience as opposed to justice. This is not the way we would talk about that today. And you've made that very clear that in the conversations about liberation and economic oppression today in Christian countries. And another thing that's important about this is that it's interesting in the Latin American context because, again, there we're dealing with a Christian context, just as we would have been in 16th century Europe. This is not secular people versus believers. This is a believing world in which everyone is participating. And yet the level of compassion seems so low as to shock me, at least.
Yeah. The Latin American context, I mean, the church through the century had a lot of authority and power because they were in bed, no, state and church, for very long.
Than any place else.
Yeah, but this situation, this tension, what Enrique Dussel have called two churches really in Latin American history, a popular church and a hierarchical official church. And these conflicts, Enrique Dussel wrote a whole thick book about the history of the church in Latin America. For him, goes back to the very colonial times, to the times of the Conquista. And I have continued to this day that there is a lot of popular movement within the church and, of course, outside the church as well, looking for emancipation, liberation, changes of the situation, looking for solutions. And, of course, there's also, as someone wrote, about Camilo, that in the 1950s and 60s, the priest was, very paternalistic. All priests were very paternalistic overall, so Camilo himself. So Camilo also was driven probably by a sense of, I need to do something for them, for my people, whatever the cost. So it's a very complex situation that has happened. But I have to say, the more I read about Camilo and also from his writings, just to discard him as just a violent priest or a revolutionary, no, there is a lot more to Camilo and many others that meets the eye at first, at least worth considering or thinking about. So sorry.
That was a very impressive talk about very impressive people. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It gave me think about how do we deal with theological concepts that imply an analysis of society that doesn't match anymore society. Thinking about Luther, you mentioned when talking about combinatorics, the institutionalized violence. That's a thought Luther never would have, that violence would be institutionalized because institution is given by God. So he thought about there would be some violent figures distorting the institutions, but the institution itself would be good and God-given. And I think that's a point we have to think about in the context of Lutheran ethics and theology. If this obviously right insight in institutionalized violence should drive us to leave Luther's concept of society behind, or, to pick up your terms, to reform Luther's understanding of society. However, the way Luther described society and interpreted it in theological terms does not apply anymore to what we know about society nowadays. And I think that was very clear in the way you presented these figures.
Yeah. Oh, thank you.
Thank you. My thoughts are unformed. I mean, your talk. Thank you for that. Has me thinking about the question what Ignacio is wrestling with, which is the question of, right, how do you bring down an order without adopting its principles? That's what I hear him wrestling with, and I don't know what the answer is to. How do you, if you have to resort to violence because there's no other way, how do you've adopted the principle of might makes right to some extent. I wonder if is he wrestling with it on those terms? I mean, really, I really want to hear you say more about that question, right? And you can say there's a need for epistemological, right, attack the truth foundations of the order. But how do you do that? See, that's what I do see Luther wrestling with in a helpful way in 1521. He knows he has to attack the truth foundations of the order, but he's got to get real space to do that. And you've got to be able to speak. You've got to have someone with a platform, with a voice, and if all those people are quashed, it's very hard to create that epistemological space. So those are I think questions rather than helpful comments. But yeah, I mean, a further question I think we need to ask is, how helpful is Luther? How helpful is he really? Because I can make an argument here very simply that, as I wouldn't be the first, that two kingdoms theory is a crass political response. He just wants to secure his position and secure his reform. And so this core Lutheran thing that we've been dealing with for 500 years now. It's 500. This core Lutheran thing that we've been dealing with for 500 years is essentially a compromised principle that doesn't really flow from, helpful, life-giving theological reflection on God. I'll shut up now. I don't know why they put me in the center. It's because I came last.
Yeah, the answer to the question about two kingdoms, I will leave it to Dr. Leppin. I wouldn't. But let me say something. It's not just about the Latin American context, traditionally speaking, but in other countries. When state, government, the elite, whoever they are, control the media. So what is left to a theologian? The pulpit, the classroom, the writings that could be published. I'm not thinking about USA, although things might be changing. No, I don't know. It's an open question right now, right? That when you in Latin America, you control who teaches at the university. You control who is named as archbishop or bishop. The government gets involved in everything. The church gains some benefits. What is left for people like, say, Pedro Casaldaliga, who was a bishop in the poorest regions of Brazil, who decided to only use flip-flop all the time because 90% of his people only could afford flip-flop. So, then how could you talk to other people? How do you address the officials, government officials, the state? So in the case of Ejacuria, he went out to the street. He joined workers' movement. He joined protests. He wrote like Camilo, in newspapers. Or in case of Camilo, he founded a newspaper. And there were only I think 2 editions. And then they were closed, right? So how do you go about dealing with the system or bringing down the institutionalized violence when the means at your disposition are lesser and lesser and more limited by the day, so to say? Questions, right?
As you pointed to me with the two governments doctrine, I would be a bit saddened if we say we leave everything behind us at this point. Before I made the point that Luther didn't grasp institutionalist violence, but he got something, and it was, as you well know, that there was not just momentously that he invented this theory. It came from Augustine, it came through late medieval reflections, so there is a strong theory behind. And I would still say there is a point in it that says we as human beings, we tend to be violent, and it is good that there is an institution that controls violence as long as this institution is controlled in itself. And it is not controlled in itself if it is institutionalized violence, but it is controlled as long as you have a partition of powers that controls that this institution fulfills what it is meant for. I think in this revised version, we could still deal with some parts of truth in Luther's doctrine, even if we might reframe it a little bit. But yeah, he had a point in it.
Well, and I'm being deliberately provocative in how I pose the question. And there are liberation readings of the Two Kingdoms doctrine that are out there for you. In fact, I stole from them today because the caution about deifying a political order comes right out there, right? There is a problem when you look at a political order and think, well, we made it. The kingdom of God is here, and we're done. Even if it's the political order you want, you are right next door to tyranny there. So, and I think lots of useful things have been done with the Two Kingdom doctrine. I am interested in the possibilities of saying, well, what if we go back to 1520? What if so many of the rich things you cited today? Maybe we should be drawing some of our political reflection from there as well.
Yeah, I was thinking about what you said. Indeed, those people who speak today about a desire for small government, for a low intrusion into the lives of people by government structures. Well, the early modern period was very much that. There was very little government in some ways, and in fact, the structures. I mean, for Luther, the only legitimate violence is institutional violence, because it's that which is managed and controlled by those who are in authority to apply it, who presumably are to be trusted, as Dr. Leppin said, trusted to do it in an appropriate and just way. And yet it's clear, I think, to everyone in 1525 that this system is out of joint. It doesn't work. The princes are perhaps moving, as Luther would say, with the legitimacy of their authority when they move against the peasants. But they're partly responsible for getting it to that point, too. And Luther is honest about that, too, that there is culpability on the part of the rulers that got them to this pass. So That's just what's so unsatisfying about this in some ways, and I understand that it's just modern people being frustrated with the limitations of our ancestors, but that they couldn't see this in a more holistic way is disappointing to me. And I just want to make one other observation to take us from the sublime to the ridiculous. Many of you will be familiar with the 2003 film version of the story of Luther, starring Joseph Fiennes, which is, I've assigned it to my Luther class this semester because, like all movies, it's a myth-making activity, and it lends itself to deconstruction. Yes, right, there you go. But one of the things that strikes me most about that particular film is that it engages with the Peasants' War as more directly than any of the previous movies on Luther, but it has to create an imaginary narrative of Luther as a compassionate pastor in order to even bring him into the juxtaposition with the Peasants' War, which of course he sees as a terrible thing that was, if he'd had a role in it, was beyond his imagining. But in order for his sort of reputation for us, his image in the film to be acceptable, they have to have seen him as someone who was compassionate toward the ills of ordinary people, who would help crippled folks and would be really a witness, a Christ-like witness in his own life. And so they make things up. That is not to say that Luther was cruel or indifferent. I'm not suggesting that. It's just that this was not something that survives in the record. And so and especially since we have Dr. Leppin here, I'm thinking, who is also an authority on Francis of Assisi, that how is Francis, by renouncing not only violence but possessions, how is he living into that reformer revolutionary mold as well? Anyway.
At least it comes by no surprise that many of the Catholic theologians of liberation are Franciscans. Of course, he was not a revolutionary in a systematic sense, but he had this kind of existential protest against what the leading layers of society in his time, represented by his parents, would perform as a life, just showing that a Christian life does not align with certain form of excluding capitalism. That's what he experienced in his time, that the growing, emerging capitalism in Italy would make many people wealthy and would exclude particular the sick and all those who were weak in some sense. And this inclusive symbolic response, that again, when I understand that there is a problem not only in individuals, but a problem in the system, that can turn into kind of systematic critique. So that are, I would say, Leonardo Boff or others name them, you can name them, that they are totally in line with Francis. And the upside for Franciscans is, compared to us Lutherans, Francis had no theory of society, so they can build a new theory of society. Luther had a theory of society which now shows its short-falling sides.
Good point.
Would it be all right if we move to questions? So, folks?
Could one of the possibilities be that to move beyond Luther, in one sense, one has to recognize that the creative character of human freedom, such that the possibility that you could say, possibility that there could be the divine institution of something in and through the exercise of human freedom, and emphasizing, you could say, its creative aspect, that it can create something new. And the means of which that could take place could be debated, but that creative character, I think, is one that you have to sort of consider, that there are more things possible than are given. And I think that's one aspect that Luther's understanding of freedom operated within, you could say, definite limits. I don't see Luther sort of spending a lot of time thinking about what's the best possible form of government. He's much more worried about, well, you get a good Christian prince and that'll take care of it. But I was just curious about that. Maybe the understanding of freedom has to be enlarged.
Well, I'll jump in and say I agree with that. Thinking in terms of what is written in the freedom of a Christian. I think they're about his focus on relationships. So in the core section of that treatise, right, he's talking about, the power of faith, right? So libertas, which also means power in this context. He's thinking about the power of faith. Faith unites you to Christ and so forth. It's there you get a lot of those really very strongly mystical passages. And the second part of that treatise turns to relationship, right? Once you have everything you need from God, again, I think he's calling on the mystical tradition. You are full, and then you overflow. Just like Jesus, the Son of God is full, and the Son of God overflows into incarnation. So you overflow on behalf of others. I think what's maybe under-theorized there is of course, he kind of imagines the Christian overflowing. You're just a giver. You're just a giver, right? Oh, there's my neighbor. They're in need, and I'm giving to them. When what I would see is what really flows from that. Well, if I'm going to talk about my neighbor's need, I have to know my neighbor. I have to know their need. I have to recognize them in their individuality and their complexity. And where he doesn't add, that I think we need to add, I have to. It's got to be a two-way street here. Otherwise, it's just, giver and receiver. And, oh, nice me, I'm giving to this poor person who needs it. What there needs to be is actual relationship. And then just to kind of, maybe this kind of gets to your point, right? Relationships involve creativity. Relationships involve the unexpected, right? That's where things take an unexpected turn. So, I would agree with what you're saying. And I do think there's a touchstone in Luther in the way he points us to relationship. And the question is, well, we have to develop the idea of what genuine relationship means and all the creative, unexpected aspects of that, far beyond what he did.
Thank you. I have a question. It occurs to me when we're talking about all of these things, and I imagine Luther writing these sermons and speeches, and we're taking them apart 500 years later and studying. But they were so often, he would write during the day and then have dinner and talk late into the night with so many. So I love, Dr. Evener, that you're talking about relationship. And the thing that I keep wondering about are those major influencers in Martin Luther's life. I'm thinking about his wife, for example, how much voice the women and the community in which he was living was really driving some of those unexpected pieces. And if there are other scholars or contemporaries of Luther that we should be paying particular attention to when we try to grasp all of these, wrestle with these questions. Thank you.
Definitely, if we look at the beginning of the Wittenberg movement, that was a group movement. So it turned out that then Luther would be the symbolic figure, the latest after the Worms Edict, the figure about whom the decision was made. Are you following the Church of Rome, or are you following Luther? A little bit like that. But he worked within a group. When they started reading the mystics, for example, you have many readers. You have Nikolaus von Amsdorf, you have Andreas Karlstadt, and all of them were working together. So it would be great for us as the historians say if there had been any recordings on the streets of Wittenberg when they met somewhere on the street, or if we could listen really at the table of Martin Luther, not what the table talks are reporting, which is a dubious source, but really, as you mentioned, the talks with Katharina. It is very clear that he appreciates her very much, and even if we have no writings except from her, it is obvious that he at several points says, you inspired me, you are my Bible, so you are the one who brings me forward. We don't have those recordings, we don't have reports about that, and that's a moment where I would say, as a historian, I cannot write this down, but fantasy always helps to understand earlier times.
Hello. At times I find myself to be an unfortunately practical person. And I have a question for you in regards to Luther's identification of need. And this is for all, not just for our primary discussion focus of need, but one of the things that we can run into in our application of addressing need is identifying if a need is what is being communicated as a need or it's what we think someone else needs. Let me ground this. If you're driving down the street or you're walking in a city and you see someone with a cardboard sign that says need money, there are schools of thought. Give money regardless of what they need. Or tell them what they need to do and give them the money. Or give them a coupon just to what you deem would be useful for them so that they cannot misspend the money, etc., etc. The examples go on. The debate is endless. What do you take from Luther's theology surrounding the need of the neighbor for these practical applications nowadays, when we see these needs that we do not have the time or the bandwidth to build that level of relationship with every single individual in need?
Well, I can start on that. I think this is another example of our world being so vastly different from Luther's, that the idea that we live in such large groups of people who don't know each other and have no connection to one another, it would be hard for him to imagine. I mean, the largest cities in Germany at his time were 30 or 40,000, and that was enormous. And so not, by our standards, middle-sized communities. And in the smaller, everyone else lived in smaller communities like Wittenberg, where pretty much I expect most people who knew everyone else by sight, even if they weren't acquainted. So there's a stronger sense of communal connectedness in that society than in ours. And you would know what people needed or how they got to where they were in life. And I think there would be a greater opportunity for compassion there. That's another part of this story of the Peasants' War that mystifies me, is that how in such communities there could have been so little understanding of the needs of the people that there wasn't greater institutional response. But that's another issue.
When you ask your question, what do we do with people to whom we don't have this kind of personal relation? It jumped to my mind, to my German mind, this is a very American question. Because part of the impact of the Reformation is that late medieval system of donation was transformed to a system of social support, a public system of social support. And I love it to live in the United States, but I'm also a proud European who says this system of public support for the poor, for public support for those who have no means on themselves, that's a very good system, and that roots in a Reformation. And I think that would be Luther's answer. The public authorities have to help those who are in need.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is when it. I mean, for one, yeah, we don't have the time to have a relationship with everybody in need, but it doesn't mean we don't have relationships or start them, and in that way, sort of witness to something important in the world. I'll say that the obvious. The larger direction here has me thinking about, thinking about my own understanding of, I talked about spirituality as being devoted to something superhuman, and that something superhuman sometimes can be very bad. The authoritarian figure, the divisive principle that this nation is better than that nation. Where it gets complicated, where I wanted to go, but you wanted me to shut up. Now, at some point, everybody would have liked to have lunch. But where it gets complicated, of course, the principle can be good, right? And that's where I see this. I see your question. There's different schools of thought on how to deal with that person in need. There's different schools of thought in the United States about how to deal, should we have a vibrant social network, or would we all just be better if we were free to pick ourselves up better by our own bootstraps? I have my opinions. But there are different schools where we may, in fact, be united by a principle at this level, but it's much harder. Okay, well, how do you apply that principle, right? How do you live? And this is a lot of our struggle, right? I can go to that person on a very different side of the aisle, and we can both agree that peace is a good thing. How do we get there? I can go to that person, we can both agree to justice is a good thing. How do we get there? I can go to that person, we can, both agree that poverty is a problem. How do we get there? And we have those different problems, and this is, yeah, I don't have a solution for that. It does point to the problem of, deifying any particular order as the means to get to that end. At the same time, it doesn't mean some orders aren't better than others.
I was in defense of the two-reign theory. I was once in a setting in Germany on an academic day when Trutz Rentorf, he's a German ethicist, was asked to defend the two-reign theory for a modern democratic society. And he went down two categories. I'll do it very quickly. He said the church's responsibility is to preach the gospel. And the primary category there is faith, hope, and charity. The democratic government's responsibility is to legislate through reason. And if you have interfaith folks in a legislature, reason is the primary category. And he went down, he said, if you want the church to govern, he said, you'll get the Ayatollah. And so the church's role is to advocate for distributive justice. The primary category on the other side, he argued, is for distributive justice, and that comes out of a category of reason, from the legislature. The final category is not revolution, but if a government becomes unjust, then the church demonstrates. That, he said, is the primary category for the church to act, is to demonstrate. Like in Leipzig, where you had the candlelight vigils to bring down a government, but not through violence. And I'm sure he was informed by Hannah Arendt's book on revolution, that revolution oftentimes leads to much more violence and death, than reform, or demonstration.
So, okay. Yeah, let me thank you. That's wonderful dialogue. And we wish we could continue, but we have reached the time. Let me just add just one more thing, if I may. I like Gustavo Gutierrez. He has been called the father, maybe now grandfather, of liberation theology, at least in the Latin American context. Gutierrez wrote this commentary on the book of Job in the OT. And he asked a question. I mean, he has many questions, but it's a book about exegesis of the book of Job. But he asked this question that he says is probably the most challenging of all questions for the theologian, but the one that could make or break a theologian as well. And he said, how do we speak about God from the place of the suffering one? And then he adds, from the place of the innocent one who suffers. And then he thinks that this question is inevitable for theologians. Why? Because of Jesus. We call him the sinless one, the innocent one who was crucified. So when there are so many crucified ones, and many of them probably because of no fault of their own, how do we speak about God? Not to them, or no, how do we speak about God from that place? And that's the kind of question that has me still thinking. But for Gutierrez, of course, he gives several answers or possibilities, and one of them is, it's a question of friendship. I mean, if you, relationships, love, becoming friends, visiting, empathy, compassion with the ones who suffer, all those who suffer, but again, especially, not just, with the innocent one who suffers with no fault of their own. Okay, I think I've said enough.
No, I was thinking about on Job and God talk and the suffering, the innocent, during this whole evolution of conversation here. That is actually, that book is timeless, and I think it addresses our current moment. I'm going to call the thing what it is, and then we can be on our way, but over 40 million Americans are going to lose their food benefits on November 1st. And those of us who are called to the pulpit this Sunday are supposed to preach about All Saints in some manner. Where is that going to take us? And what about our context and the people we are called to serve, but also to afflict when they're too comfortable? And with that, God bless you, and thank you for being here on this day. And let's show appreciation for our panel. With cause. So I'm grateful to the four of you, and thank you all for being here, and I hope that this day was as fulfilling for you as it was for me. So blessings on your travels and your preaching this Sunday.